So this project is about climate change. And what I'm going to try to do is give you not only a bit of a report of what we've been trying to do and what we've accomplished, but also some of our failures, because this work actually is challenging, and we've had some failures. And so I've been trying to also reflect on those and see what that means for doing this kind of research. So this does not want to work. So I'll start with a bit of a general description. I'll tell you a bit more about climate tipping points, because it tends to be something that people don't know much about, which is actually the reason for having the project. And then our project phases and how they integrated stakeholder engagement. As Laurel mentioned, much of the effort here with these projects was to create much earlier stakeholder engagement and move away from the model of just disseminating knowledge once we have produced it. And then a bit about findings and outputs, which we are still producing, because actually this project is not finished yet. We're still working on things until the middle of the year. And then a bit of an outlook. So what we've been trying to do with the Gaming Climate Futures project is science policy engagement, to really get into the weeds of scientists interacting with policymakers and decision makers to understand a topic that we believed, do not know yet much about, and which we think is an important topic, which is climate tipping points, which have been the subject of an increasing body of research in the climate sciences for about 15 years, but really haven't been picked up by decision makers in the international climate negotiation community. So we're trying to encourage individuals in the climate negotiation community to engage with that topic, and we're trying to do that by using a so-called serious game. So we try to respond really to the knowledge needs, picking people up where they are to say, what do you know about this topic so far, and then create an engagement process that would build on that existing knowledge state, and using a serious game to expand on that and create an understanding for climate tipping points and how they relate to global temperature goals. So that was supposed to create opportunities to learn or to create understanding for this phenomenon, and to imagine the kinds of futures that collective decisions could actually create. So kind of more of a long-term imagination and thinking capacity among participants that we are hoping feeds back on their current decision-making processes to impact today's choices. So our objectives were to provide decision-making support for those global political actors by creating an environment for learning, thinking, and imagining, also feeling, so emotions play a big role in this. And we did this by designing a serious game that works at a global scale. As far as we know, global scale serious games for decision makers do not exist, at least not very commonly. So we've tried something new, and we were aware this was a big challenge because it's a community that's very hard to reach and to engage. They don't have a lot of time for games. We tried nevertheless. So the topic will focus on understanding the relationship between global temperature goals, which you might also be familiar with, Paris Agreement and that kind of stuff, and climate tipping points. And our key aim was not just to create that kind of game for this community, but to study the cognitive and political effects of playing the game. So not just playing a game, but seeing, does the game actually do what we hope it will do? And what does the game do to those who play it, in their minds and in the political sphere? And then I think implicitly we were hoping, in terms of impact, policy impact directly, to promote a discussion of climate tipping points, and hopefully in the medium term that somebody would pick that up in the negotiations and say, we need to think harder about that. Now, my team was super interdisciplinary, and I'm just giving you a bit of a sense for the disciplines involved. It really would not have been possible without trying to pull on the natural sciences, and most of them are back there, which is fabulous. On the social sciences and decision making, but also on library science and on game design and futures thinking. So here are most of my colleagues, but very importantly, we also worked with a lot of graduate and undergraduate students who have done lots of our work. So Roberta is in the back of the room, the other graduate students not. We had some undergraduates, and very important, our game designers were actually undergraduate students from Glasgow Caledonian University. So people who had to do the key work for us were actually undergraduates, which we took a big risk. Given the budget, it was a necessary risk. And I would say it worked out, right, David? So, yes. And David can maybe tell you a little bit more about that if you have questions about that process. He was supervising these students for about 8 months over 2 courses where they would be developing this game under our guidance and with our input. So project phases, like every project, you need some time to gear up. But we decided that we needed a first phase to figure out what do people in this negotiation community actually know about tipping points. So we went out to figure out what they know with surveys and interviews. That was difficult empirical work. Roberta did much of that, gathering surveys. And then based on that knowledge we had gathered, we designed the game. That in itself, I'll tell you more about that. And then we used that game and went back to the community to play it with them, and then we tried to study that. And then there's a reason why phase number 5, observation of impacts, did actually not really, or long-term impacts in the political sphere did not take place. I'll let you know about that one too. So we had to really kind of stop with the study of the immediate cognitive and emotional effects among players themselves. We were not able to go that final step that we had hoped to do, which by itself is really difficult social science to do methodologically, but for reasons inherent in our project and in the risks we were taking, that was not possible. So here's our engagement model. It looks very simple. But we said, we as a research team, we had the idea that there is a problem in terms of the state of knowledge among decision makers. So we took that as a starting point and said, the stakeholder knowledge state is our starting point, so we have to find out about that one. Then once we know about that, we can design the game to build on that. So it's really, stakeholders are built into the project design and it's the entire cycle of this. Then during game design, we checked in with the stakeholders again. We had a stakeholder visit. A former negotiator of the Obama administration, Andrew Light, came to speak, gave a public lecture here, and talked to us about actually recruitment challenges and how to engage our community. And then we ran gameplay workshops. And our sense is that those should have fed back into the initial stakeholder knowledge base, right? So that then the circle closes. And the dissemination version of science policy engagement is part of it, but really only really an afterthought in terms of policy briefs. I would also communicate what we learned about climate tipping points and so forth to this policy community. So briefly about climate tipping points, you probably have not heard about it, because that's something the decision-making community also has largely not heard about. So there are points or thresholds in large-scale components of the climate system at which a small quantitative change can trigger a nonlinear or abrupt change process that is driven by system internal feedback mechanisms and leads to a qualitatively different state of the system, which is often irreversible. That sounds very complicated, but it means a large-scale system can transform from the state it is currently in, that's very stable, to a very different state that looks very different than anything humans have ever experienced. I'll give you a couple of examples in a minute. Important also, global temperature goals is the second concept for our project. From the Paris Agreement, I've written down what the Paris Agreement says about those, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So that's what the international community is trying to do. So these are examples of climate tipping points. You can see they're spread all around the world. They're very different in their nature. So diversity among tipping points is one key thing. No tipping point is like the other. Some of them are biospheric, some of them are circulation patterns, ice sheets. So they're very different in terms of how they work, how they temporarily unfold, and what kinds of impacts they would have. All of those characteristics are really important for decision makers. So here we're saying, like, key characteristics, what I said before, they have multiple stable states. They can transform from how they look now. If you take the Amazon, for example, now a rainforest, the largest rainforest on the planet, could transform into a savanna, would make the South American continent and also the world look and feel very different, right? So those kinds of large, significant changes in major components of the climate system. And for our game, we had to pick a few, because there are lots of them we could have chosen. We included the West Antarctic ice sheet, the Arctic summer sea ice, the coral reefs, the boreal forest, and the Indian summer monsoon, not on this chart. Now, in terms of project phases, I told you we started with the idea of gauging stakeholder information needs to design this game. So we collected surveys, both on paper with approaching folks during the negotiations themselves, or online. We included we included negotiators, so representatives of countries, then the large observer community that consists of NGOs, of intergovernmental organizations, the business community, and researchers. So all of those were included. For the surveys, actually, we have more than 80% participation from diplomats. So that's really the key community we're trying to approach. That was very good to have that response rate. For our gameplay later, it looks very different. And we interviewed individuals to go a little into more depth to understand where they're at. And we found that the knowledge generally is very limited of tipping points. At this point, more than 60% of people have never even heard of the concept before. So something that could be this dramatic with significant consequences for the future of life on the planet, and people don't know it. So a large number of people just don't know it. We think that matters. Only roughly 17% have detailed knowledge we would consider sufficient for decision making on this topic or for global governance. And only one characteristic really stands out that those who know something about this topic care about, and that is irreversibility. So there's a very limited knowledge base. It's not the topic of discussion, and there's really no long-term thinking or imagination going on in the climate negotiations. So based on those findings, we decided the game should do these things, right? We start from scratch. We have to introduce some basic facts, bring the basic idea to folks, hopefully through the game, for them to gather an idea of what is a tipping point, how does it work, and how does it relate to global temperature goals, right? That controlling temperature is also a control of tipping points. And that we would try to develop long-term thinking and imagination among players, and of course to encourage further knowledge seeking about tipping points, so that maybe at some point this will be picked up in the negotiations. Game design. I could talk a long time about the challenges of game design. It is a truly interdisciplinary process that's probably more art than science. Was a really interesting, challenging process. So as I mentioned, we worked with undergraduates, an amazing team for about 8 months. We ran 2 game design workshops here at Purdue over the course of that year to make that work. We started with identifying game goals, as I just told you, that were informed by prior research. And then a whole lot of other stuff had to happen, from programming to designing artwork to thinking about what the process in the room for a player would look like, because those are all different components that were needed to develop this kind of game experience. It's not just a virtual game, it is actually an experience that is a simulation of the climate negotiations themselves. And then there was a need for lots of material for the players, background information, something called event cards, lots of that kind of paper-based material and information material. And then there was, of course, an intense phase of game testing and adjustments, and that went until the very last minute before the game. So we have a number of stories to tell about that. But we got a game and we played. But we also learned a lot about the challenges of using this kind of engagement tool, or trying to use it for global governance to interact with decision makers. I'm trying to list a few here. I think this is still far from the depth that we could explore. But interdisciplinary communication, everything you've heard about in the panel before, is certainly a big, big challenge, right? Speaking one language, crossing disciplines. One of the key challenges here was really to bring in the reality of the climate negotiations. So the game had to reflect what the politics look like, what the reality is. So the Paris Agreement as a current status quo of global governance on this, but also a serious modeling of the global economy and the climate. So kind of bringing that in to help players really buy into the game, and to think that when they make choices in the game, and the game feeds back a response to them, it says it gets this much warmer, or a tipping point happens at this point in time, this is what's happening, is actually believable, right? That they would say this could happen in the real world, because only then would we be able to have an effect on what they were doing and thinking. And doing that was really, really tough. Basically, a mini conversation like the IPCC has about what kinds of models are we using, and what should the model parameters look like, and what is a good Earth economy model, right? This is, we kind of try to simplify that in our conversations here. So that's just one of the big challenges that we've been dealing with throughout this. But yeah, so I'm listing a few of those really difficult things that we had to deal with, and we learned a lot about game design, and I think the output is rather interesting. We also dealt with communication challenges across continents, across time zones, all that kind of stuff, and with limited resources, right? That always matters in the kinds of projects that we're running. So we, for example, imagine at some point that we would add a virtual reality component to the future imagination part of our game, where we would put people into an immersive environment to show them a future of 2118 where tipping points have passed, what it would be like to walk around in that world. We did not end up having the resources to develop that kind of immersive experience, and given our game impacts, we actually started to doubt whether that would have been a good idea, because what we did do was already emotionally very impactful, and for some people overwhelming, negatively overwhelming, to imagine futures where tipping points have happened, that we started to think maybe the VR would have put them over the edge. So maybe that would have been too much, and we need to be really careful in terms of how we're affecting what people think and what they feel with what we're doing, right? It's a responsibility in projects like this one, where you're actually affecting people's emotional lives and their beliefs about the future, heavily, potentially. So then I mentioned we had towards the end of the game design project, a stakeholder visit by Andrew Light, which was really interesting to learn about how we could actually approach this community of negotiators, the limitations. We were aware of the limitations of recruiting for game sessions, but he brought that home to us and had some ideas for how to do it differently in the future. And then here we were at the climate negotiations in Bonn in 2018. And last minute changes that David made like probably 5 in the morning on the day of the game. But it actually worked. We had three interesting sessions in Bonn, and then 4 more later that year. So the game itself, very briefly, it's a combination of a face-to-face role-playing game for exactly 30 players who represent different countries organized in 10 negotiation alliances. It mirrors very much the Paris Agreement on climate change, where countries bring to the table domestic promises of action every 5 years. So they're not obligated to coordinate with anybody else. Just every 5 years they say, this is what we're willing to do. And then we would take those choices and have them input through devices into our climate economy model that would spit out how the climate would be changing and how economies would be changing over time. And we would move in 5-year steps, increments into the future. So participants get feedback from the system immediately in terms of what their choices actually do. How much warmer does it get? How do their economies do? And do they increase or decrease the chance of passing tipping points? And when do tipping points actually happen? So tipping points can be triggered through these changes that people create with their mitigation choices, their adaptation choices, and so forth. It's a significant time commitment, which is part of the challenge, what's part of the challenge to recruit for our project. 3 to 4 hours playtime. As a real IAM in the background of this, it has 2 parts. The first part is a formal negotiation, as I just mentioned, similar to the climate negotiations right now. And the second part then moves players artificially into 2118 and says, now let's step out of the negotiator role and let's imagine how people live in 2118, given that you have triggered a couple of tipping points with your choices. What did you create for people in the future? And we gave them story prompts. So we developed story beginnings in 4 different places around the world. And small groups of people, 3 or 4 people, would sit with each other and try to finish the story they were given. The story prompts were fairly neutral in terms of where they could take them. And then we observed whether they would be terrible stories of death and destruction or hopeful stories of, well, maybe it's not all that bad. There's always hope and innovation and technology and all those good things and love in the world. So this is what it looks like for the player. This is the interface that shows you temperature change, economic data, tipping point information on the right. The player interface here that shows you where they could enter how much money they're willing to spend on what. And these are the tipping points. So when they start the game, the coral reef tipping point has already passed, as it has in the real world. The Arctic summer sea ice and the West Antarctic ice sheet are hard to avoid, and in most play sessions they actually were triggered, which caused some real interesting effects in the room. And these other 2 tipping points actually never got triggered because they need higher trigger temperatures, so players don't have to worry too much about them, but they don't know that when they play. So these were the knowledge or the learning goals for players, changes in knowledge and understanding, particular tipping points. Then also changes in beliefs and values, right? Based on an understanding of what these events might do, maybe they would reflect on national interests or what they perceive to be their national interests or their personal interests in climate politics. And then also impacts on emotions or feelings. How urgent do they think it is what they do? How curious are they about tipping points, right? All those interesting emotions that are important for this context. And skills, we were hoping also for a bit of an increase in their ability to think long term and their ability to understand systems, especially the climate system and its temporal dynamics and its complexities. How are we doing on time? All right. So we played 7 game sessions in 2018. 5 of those at the sidelines of the UNFCCC negotiations in Bonn and Katowice, 1 at Purdue, and 1 in Washington, D.C., and the sidelines of the AGU annual meeting. We had about 70 participants. However, you see that the opposite occurred then to our surveys. We only had about 15% of diplomats, and this is one of the key challenges of our project, which we knew going into this, was to recruit among the target community of our project, right? We had to get folks in the room who are actually very busy trying to negotiate a global climate change agreement. And we put a lot of work and effort into that. We knew this could be the piece where stuff falls apart. If nobody signs up, we don't have a game workshop, we have no data, we can't study game effects. So we tried to mitigate that by also, of course, including this larger community, not just diplomats. But we had a really tough time, despite all our efforts. We had even lots of people sign up and say, sure, this is interesting, I'll come. It was a Sunday between the 2 negotiation weeks, but then just wouldn't show up or had something else come up. So we ended up with very few diplomats themselves in our sessions. More participants from the larger negotiation community of observers, so NGOs, business community, and researchers. So this gives us some idea of how the game will impact this community, but we are, of course, very limited in our findings in terms of what diplomats actually take from this. But that is one of the challenges of stakeholder engagement. If they do not want to be engaged, if they have no time to be engaged, no matter what we do and how attractive we try to make it with good food and a nice location and really the promise of something valuable for their own learning, can't help it, right? So if you try to reach these people, how do we reach them? We know now that it's almost impossible to reach them at these negotiation sessions. So we're thinking about other strategies. Should we go to the capitals before they ever come to the negotiations themselves? Should we have maybe sessions at other meetings in between the climate negotiations that are not that busy or not that high stake? So how do we engage this community is a real challenge for us, and that's why, because we failed to recruit enough people to understand how the game would impact diplomats' minds, that we also could not then observe how that might affect the politics during the negotiations afterwards, right? There was no point in trying to look for long-term effects of the game on the negotiations because we just didn't have enough negotiators in the room. So that's why phase 5 basically dropped out very late in our project, because it was just not possible to observe anything long-term if we didn't have enough people to study. So that's just what happens, that not everything works out. Yeah, we had quite a bit of stuff not working out. But the folks who did attend, we collected pre and post game surveys from them, asking the same questions, pre and post, to figure out what they actually learned, what they took away. And we took lots of notes and observed gameplay itself. So we have some really interesting data about those game sessions that happened. Here are some impressions from those game sessions. People who did attend, you'll hear more about that from Steve Koller, who's going to come up in a moment, one of our attendees, seem to have had a really interesting and impactful experience. We had some very strong responses, and I'm just giving you some examples of the feedback that we got from some of our players. And some of these quotes, I believe, are from diplomats, not all of them are. So sometimes decision makers don't realize the impact of their current decisions on the future. This game helped us do so. The workshop was a great way to connect the dots between tipping points and the negotiation process. This is an excellent opportunity for members of our delegation in Poland. I participated in the initial negotiation simulation. It was a most helpful experience. The idea of climate tipping points is important, and understanding it better is an aid in advocacy. But there are also clearly general positive impacts to learn how the negotiations work. We've actually been approached whether we would be willing to play this game to train junior diplomats, just in general, to get an understanding for how do climate negotiations work, because there's a real benefit to that, and the game does that really well. That was not our intention, But it mirrors now the Paris Agreement, and there is not yet a game out there that does that. So there's a real benefit just to that side effect of our game. And then by sitting in the hot seat through this decision-making process, I feel like I now have a better understanding of how some countries' constraints, risks, and interests all interact. So there's a real learning process going on for folks. We are still studying really what the learning is in terms of understanding, in terms of risk perceptions, in terms of different emotions, in terms of thinking about the future. So we're sitting on this data now. We're trying to exploit it and write the papers from this and do the data analysis, but this is just some initial anecdotal feedback from our attendees. So I mentioned challenges, in particular recruitment. That was one of so the first big risk was game design. This could have failed completely at that stage. The second big risk was recruitment for this particular community. And I think on both counts, we did well enough to say we succeeded, right? But, I mean, it was still challenging, but we got data, we got game sessions, we engaged 70 people, and some of them were diplomats, so that is something. There were other challenges like game performance and technical issues. Once you do a serious game, that's actually open yourself up to a whole host of technological challenges, including internet failure in a hotel or in a facility where you think, why? So never thought about that one. Data collection was hard. People do not like to do surveys, in particular if you ask them twice in the same day. So this is really difficult to get good data on the kind of data that we needed. Then facilitation is a real challenge. It's a facilitation-heavy game experience, and to make that consistent would require some training. So it's all the stuff that needs a little more work in the long term, but difficult things to do when you do projects like this. So something on findings and outputs. As I mentioned, this is still ongoing, so we're still doing data analysis and writing at this point. But in addition to having developed a cool and impactful game, having engaged more than 400 decision makers and researchers in our surveys, and having played with, hopefully impacted about 70 individuals, we are also developing a range of papers right now. First of all, of course, on this key finding of the knowledge gap, that there is a significant gap in understanding and knowledge of tipping points among the decision makers that should know about this stuff. So I have a little piece that's more of an opinion piece in the works that's trying to point out that this gap exists, that it matters, it's important. Then we have a paper in development that's trying to explain this. Where does it come from? So an issue that's like a learning issue, an organizational issue, so explaining it. Then a paper on risk perceptions, related to tipping points. One on more general thoughts on the future as a governance object. So how long or short-term oriented are our global governance institutions when it comes to climate change? And what are the thought processes that exist in relation to long-term governance? Like, can people actually think about 100 years? Are we capable of that? If not, how do we create those capacities for long-term governance? And then, of course, this whole really interesting question of how do we design simulation games, or more generally maybe, science policy engagement processes for impact, whether that's in climate governance or in other areas, but this is a really interesting separate area that we're also trying to write the paper about. And then I mentioned we did intend to write policy briefs. We have one in development on climate tipping points themselves, and another couple of ideas we thought would be valuable. I'm not sure we're still going to get to those, but since those are kind of just as a secondary vehicle for us to engage the community, this was not a priority, since for us the engagement with them through gameplay was really the primary engagement approach. But we might want to draft or want to think about one on climate tipping points and global temperature goals and more of the governance approach, and then serious game design to support global governance. We did have quite a bit of interesting media exposure and interest of this project. So some of these are authored by our universities and ourselves, but for example, I was approached by NPR Science Friday to talk about climate change based on some of this work that we've done. The CBC actually was interested and did a little TV segment, that's also a radio segment, just earlier this year, so there was quite a bit of interest in this from the media as well. And given what we've done, we are thinking about the next round. We thought we just got a taste for how impactful this could be. we kind of scratched the surface and we have something that works and we're excited about it, but we also have a sense, and David could tell you a lot more about that, what you could do, what's actually possible with this kind of experience. If you could make it more sophisticated, more interactive, more flexible, there is a huge potential for impact. If we solve our recruitment challenge, so we're really keen to move forward to create the 2.0 version of the game, whatever that looks like. That needs to be really specific. We need to think hard about our audience, right? We're also thinking about audience expansion. Maybe that community shouldn't be the only one that we want to play with. And an educational game version, something to take to high schools, to college classrooms, and so forth. There's already huge interest among the folks who played with us, who want to play it. And then, of course, we're thinking about more gameplay for impact. So we have something we could play already, so maybe we should just want to take it on the road and do some of that, and also study, of course, how that works. And we already submitted a workshop proposal for the AGU fall meeting this year, where we want to explore with more earth science folks how gaming or something like this could be used both in research, in teaching, in engagement, and in global governance. There's lots of potential to be explored. And I think that is all from me.